Welcome back for part 2 of our encounter with the life and work of brilliant women in art history. Today we take a look at late 19th century names like Suzanne Valadon and Camille Claudel, and 20th century figures that created a powerful path for future women artists to walk on. Frida Kahlo, Romaine Brooks, Leonora Carrington, and others. I hope you will enjoy. Suzanne Valadon. She was born Marie Clémentine Valadon in 1865 in a small town in western France as the daughter of a poor unmarried laundress. After a series of odd jobs, she found employment as an acrobat in a circus, a long dream of hers. At some point in her childhood, she started drawing and painting, and being at the circus, she most certainly saw young modern artists like Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, which spent most of his career in Montmartre, at the circus, at the Moulin Rouge, and so on. But a back injury stopped young Valadon from being able to perform in the circus again. Instead, she became a model for painters like Lautrec, Berthe Morisot, Auguste Renoir. We can see her in the paintings of Auguste Renoir like Dance at Bougival, Girl Braiding Her Hair, or Dance in the City. She saw being among them the most advanced modern techniques she could ever see because she was in the midst of it all in Paris. She modeled for Toulouse-Lautrec, which called her Suzanne after the biblical story of Susanna and the elders. Susanna, a beautiful young woman, was lusted after by old men, and he called her that because she modeled nude often for older men. They had an affair that lasted 2 years and ended with Suzanne trying to commit suicide because Lautrec wouldn't marry her. She later had an affair with composer A. Satie for a few months, which she broke off, leaving him devastated. She married a stockbroker but didn't stop her from having other affairs. It's safe to say that she lived like the male painters of her generation rather than the female Morisot or Cassattes of the era. Her work began with mostly charcoals and pastels, and later in the 1890s, oil paintings which feature self-portraits, portraits of her mother, of her son, future painter Maurice Utrillo, which she raised without his natural father. Her style can mostly be defined as post-impressionist with strong compositions, much use of color and bold lines to outline the shapes of the object or characters. She had a free, realistic approach to female nudes she painted, unlike Morisot or Cassatt, which were members of the upper class and couldn't paint like the men did. But Valadon had no restraints, and she even painted nude portraits of herself. Suzanne Valadon died at the age of 72 after suffering a stroke and had her painter friends attending her funeral, as well as younger generation of artists such as Georges Braque or Pablo Picasso. Camille Claudel. Camille Claudel is named the woman genius of sculpture, but was for a long time known to the wider public as a muse and lover of renowned French sculptor Auguste Rodin. Claudel was born in 1864 in a small town in northern France to parents with mixed origin. Her mother descended from farmers and clergy, and her father was working in banking. Her family situation was pretty good, and she was the eldest of 3 children. Her brother Paul Claudel would also grow up to be famous, but for writing plays and poetry, and he was also a diplomat. Camille displayed a passion and natural inclination for sculpting and molding clay into human figures from childhood. Her mother did not support Camille's talent, but her father took her to the atelier of sculptor Alfred Boucher to inquire if the young girl had any real talent that was worth pursuing. Boucher confirmed that indeed the young Camille had tremendous talent, and it would be very beneficial to have it trained further. Camille started training for a future career with sculptor Alfred Boucher, which became her mentor, and she even made a bust with his image. Women sculptors were extremely rare in the 19th century, and the Academy of Fine Arts in Paris did not accept them, because first of all, sculpting was attributed only to men, as it involved studies after nude male models, and it was believed that a woman wasn't capable to model clay and carve stone like a man could. The only academy that was progressive enough to accept women students was the Colarossi, now known as the Grand Chaumier. So Claudel enrolled there and began her formal training as well, with Alfred Boucher continuing to mentor her. Fate had it that Boucher moved to Italy and no longer had plans to teach in Paris, so he left sculptor Auguste Rodin to continue his work. This is how Claudel and Rodin crossed paths and began a relationship that will last for 10 almost good years and many more bitter ones separated. Camille Claudel was only 19 years old when she met Rodin, and he was 43. She started to work in Rodin's atelier in 1883 and quickly began a romantic relationship with him, although he was living with Rose Buret from 1864, Camille's birth year. Camille was fiercely jealous of Rose, making fun of her with her art, like the sketch. An old rose with a broom and Rodin next to her, chained and completely under her control. Rodin didn't marry Rose either until 1970, sometime before they both died. For 10 years, Claudel and Rodin worked together on Rodin's projects, large-scale statuary groups, or installments like The Gate of Hell, for which Claudel, among others, did a lot of work. Camille was his muse and lover, and he consulted with her about his own work and didn't make permanent decisions before talking to Camille. Likewise, Camille took his advice, although she rarely had any time to do her own work, and when she did, people accused her of imitating Rodin, which anybody that has a look at her work can easily see is not true. He was a master of neoclassical, formal, figurative sculpture, while she was the promise of the new style, not as polished surfaces, more dynamic composition, different subjects. She was the master of the modern sculpture, the kind of modernity that would culminate with Constantin Brancusi. He was also an apprentice of Rodin, but quickly gave it up as he couldn't put his vision into practice, and he said, "Nothing can grow in the shade of great oak trees," and moved on to be the greatest phenomenon since Michelangelo. Camille eventually grew financially dependent on Rodin, and she resented this status. As she couldn't sell anything, she exhibited all over, at the Salon d'Atome, at the Salon des Indépendants, but to no lucrative perspective. Eventually, after 10 years of on-again, off-again relationship with Rodin, she separated from him. She no longer agreed that they be intimate, just companions. This infuriated Rodin, and that is when life began increasingly difficult for Claudel. There are a number of things that happened to Claudel in this period. She was pregnant with Rodin's child and had an abortion, and that was the time she ended the intimacy with the sculptor. She completed a complex statuary group project called The Mature Age, an allegory depicting 3 characters, an old man representing maturity, an old woman representing old age and death, and a young woman who is reaching for the older man in an attempt to save him from death. It's easy to see the connection to her situation in the love triangle with Rodin, Rose Buret, and herself, the young component. Rodin was furious when he saw the piece and not only withdrew his support for Camille, but made it so that she didn't get government funding for her work and didn't get commissions. Her mother banished her from the family home after the father's death because of her scandal-causing affair with Rodin and her choice to do sculpture for a living. Camille found herself with no support, no home, no money, and a dim perspective for the future. By this time, she destroyed many of her works after accusations that she was a fraud who copied Rodin. The fact that her master would sign the works of the apprentice while they were working together as a common practice so that they would have support, and Camille also had some of her work signed by Rodin, proved to be a great disadvantage at this point. She made Women Chatting in 1897, and something had changed. She told her brother Paul that in this work there is really nothing of Rodin, and it was truly new and unseen before, in terms of technique and style, Rodin himself not having the ability to carve and shape material, especially marble, like Claudel did. The Wave is another example of breakthrough in terms of subject, execution, and finishing. Although there were many which acknowledged that Claudel was a valuable artist in her own right, she couldn't even compete with much lesser talented men. and she became increasingly obsessed with the idea that Rodin is ruining her prospects of selling work and getting commissions, and even trying to get rid of her by any means possible. At the beginning of the 20th century, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and by the efforts of her mother and her brother, she was committed to a psychiatric hospital. While being there, doctors tried to convince her family she didn't belong in a hospital, but her mother and brother still kept her there and denied she received mail from anybody else. Unfortunately, she never got out and died in 1943 after spending 30 years in a mental institution, and was buried in a communal grave at the asylum, along with other patients in relative anonymity. Her family did not attend the funeral. Nowadays, much of her work can be seen at the Camille Claudel Museum, opened in 2017 in Nogent-sur-Seine, her childhood place, to celebrate the work of a tormented soul who dedicated her life to her art, pushing the genre into the next century as the work of one of the great sculptors of the world. Tamara de Łempicka, or if we go with the Polish pronunciation of her name, which is the accurate one, we say Tamara de Łempicka. She was born in Poland as Tamara Rosalia Górwik-Gorska in 1898 in a wealthy Polish family. Her parents and grandparents were members of the Polish elite and were friendly with numerous leading figures of the cultural scene, including Arthur Rubinstein. She married a wealthy young lawyer, Tadeusz Lempicki, in 1916. They were living in St. Petersburg at the time the Russian Revolution started, and as they were members of the elite class, they were in danger and had to leave Russia. They settled in Paris, and this is when Tamara de Łempicka's artistic life begins. Due to financial difficulties and the arrival of their daughter Kizet, Tamara decided to harness her painting talent and take it seriously and try to make a living out of it. She studied at the Grande Chaumière Academy with painters Maurice Denis and André Lot, and started to exhibit her portraits of friends, family, especially her daughter Kizet, and still lives at the salons available in Paris, including the Faux Salon, the Tuileries, and the Salon of Women Painters. After this, she received an exhibition in Italy and had offers from fashion magazines to do cover illustrations, such as the German magazine Die Dame, who commissioned the self-portrait in a green Bugatti. From this time on, it was success after success. She painted portraits of aristocrats and royalty such as King Alfonso XIII of Spain, Queen Elizabeth of Greece, and her work featured alongside avant-garde artists like Diego Rivera, Willem de Kooning, and Georgia O'Keeffe. She eventually divorced and remarried Baron Kufner, a Hungarian nobleman, and they moved to the United States, settling finally in New York. As a side note, the fact that she was married didn't stop her to engage in many affairs with both men and women, as she was openly bisexual. In America, she began painting film stars from Hollywood, and she cultivated the life of a beautiful, elegant, wealthy, cultured, avant-garde artist. Her style is something utterly unique and is described as Art Deco because it embodied all its aesthetic principles. She was the most famous icon of Art Deco. She pursued a uniqueness to stand aside from the rest of art, which, in her own words, had sank into banality, which gave her a feeling of disgust. We can certainly see the influence of Cubism in her work in the form of its second phase, synthetic Cubism, which adopts a more flattened-out image with the emphasis shifting from perspective to color and textures. In her case, the shine and gloss of fabrics of dresses and nightgowns, with a very decorative touch worn by the elegant, stylish women of the upper class in their fabulous lifestyles. Tamara de Łempicka moved to Mexico after the art world lost interest in her work and in Art Deco altogether, and continued to paint old subjects, reinterpreted and new ones, but never exhibited again, starting with the late 1960s. There were new things happening in art, abstract expressionism, performance art, and not to mention Andy Warhol's factory, which was all the talk of the 1960s and 70s. She died in beautiful Cuernavaca in Mexico in 1980 with her daughter Gisette by her side. I think that self-portrait in a green Bugatti sums up Tamara de Łempicka best. She was the ultimate 20s Art Deco diva, even though in reality her green Bugatti was in fact a yellow Renault. Romaine Brooks. As photography continued to develop, classical painting became increasingly irrelevant. The artist had to contribute more to the image, had to show us their inner world or reflect our own. There was one artist at the beginning of the 20th century that painting using the color palette of black and white photographs. This was rare and extremely intriguing in an art world in complete turmoil as new generations of artists struggled to push their way into relevance and become the new reality, the new norm. This intriguing artist was Romaine Brooks, an American born in Italy, living and working in Paris. She was born Beatrice Romaine Goddard in 1874 in Rome, in a wealthy American Goddard family. Her father left the house when she was really small. Her mother and her other two siblings moved to New York. Her mother suffered from mental illness and completely neglected Romaine and her sister in favor of their brother, who was suffering from a psychological disorder as well. Her mother left the small Romaine with a poor foster family somewhere in New York, where she stayed until she was old enough to go to boarding school. At 19, Romaine left New York for Paris with very little money from her mother, and she worked in a Parisian cabaret as a singer. She had a child in that time, which she gave up to a monastery. After that, she went on to live on the island of Capri, where she lived literally as a starving artist. Around that time, she was called back to New York because her brother had died, followed by their mother very soon after. This situation left Romaine and her sister Maya with a family estate and wealth and could now travel and live as an independent artist. She returned to Paris where she mingled in high society. Unlike her generation of poor artists living in Montmartre or Montparnasse, barely making a living, trying to make it in the art world. Romaine Brooks was a great success in Paris, painted portraits for the rich and famous, with her first exhibition at the famous Durand-Ruel Gallery. She painted almost exclusively portraits, mostly women, and although in the beginning she used color in her art, starting with 1905 she began to explore the different variations of black, white, and gray, and never went back. This was her signature style, with only a few accents of red and earth tones. A bit like James McNeill Whistler, if you will, but with the twist of 20th century modernity. In her private life, Romaine Brooks had multiple relationships with women, and she did no effort to hide her sexuality. She was involved with socialite Winnaretta Singer, the Princess of Polignac, Russian dancer Ida Rubinstein, the American writer Natalie Clifford Barney, and French writer Lily de Gramont. Brooks lived with the last two women for over 50 years. Her Brooks name came from a very brief marriage to her friend John Ellingham Brooks when she was very young. They married for companionship, as both of them were gay and involved with other people. She kept the name Brooks as she probably wanted to forget her traumatic childhood with her family and didn't want to further associate with them. As for her look, she dressed in something of a men's attire which she designed herself. By the 1930s, Romaine Brooks was generally forgotten, and after the war she was busier with arranging her exhibitions in various places than painting. But she started a series of drawings from one continuous line of all sorts of characters that she thought sprung directly from her subconscious mind. Romaine Brooks died in Nice, France in 1970 at the age of 96. Her legacy today remains in the work of contemporary artists that are inspired to express their gender identity or sexuality through their art. Margaret Macdonald Mackintosh. Remember, you are half, if not 3/4, in all my architectural work. Margaret has genius, I have only talent. These are the words of Charles Rennie Mackintosh used to describe his wife Margaret Macdonald Mackintosh. Margaret Macdonald was born in Tipton, Staffordshire in 1864 to a well-to-do middle-class family with a sister and 3 brothers. The family moved to Glasgow, where her father was working as a colliery manager and engineer. Soon, Margaret and her sister Frances enrolled in the Glasgow School of Art to study design. They became instrumental in defining the Glasgow style according to Art Nouveau principles at the dawning of the new century. They were part of the art group the Glasgow Girls, and when the 2 sisters met architects Charles Rennie Mackintosh and Herbert McNair, they all became known as the Four. The Four had a vision for house interiors which combined art, architecture, and design in a manner that would bring great success with many exhibitions around the world and countless commissions. Frances married Herbert McNair in 1899, and 1 year later Margaret and Charles Mackintosh would marry. Margaret and Charles, who was acknowledged as the best architect in Scotland, were the definition of a power couple surrounded by success. Margaret worked with metal, textiles. She revived the gesso technique for decorative panels and did book illustrations for the Odyssey, biblical stories, poems by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and her favorite, the Belgian poet Maurice Maeterlinck. Margaret Macdonald's characters, extremely stylized, were a source of inspiration for Austrian Secession painter Gustav Klimt. He saw her work alongside her husband in the Secession building in Vienna, where they exhibited. The Mackintoshes were commissioned by original Secession patron Fritz Werendorfer to decorate his villa just outside of Vienna. That was a project with many contributors such as Joseph Hoffmann and Coleman Moser as well. They also did the room de luxe at the Willow Tea Room in Glasgow. They were building an international reputation, but Margaret wasn't seen as her husband's equal, although he gave her much of the credit for their mutual work and success. Critics saw his work being uselessly adorned and embellished with feminine elements. But she was more than just the gesso decorative panels. She had a vision that was so well synchronized with the movements of the era like arts and crafts, Wiener Werkstätte, Secession, or Art Nouveau happening in the 1900s, taking inspiration from Celtic art and folklore and symbolism as well as mystical poetry. Margaret Macdonald Mackintosh's body of work showcased her range as an artist. Skilled in a variety of media such as watercolor, metalwork, embroidery, and textiles, she is reputed to be one of the most talented artists of the early 20th century in Britain. She effectively stopped working from the early 1920s because of her husband's declining health and as well as her own. She died in 1933, 5 years after her husband, in London. Margaret left about 140 works behind, which is very little for such a prolific artist. Frida Kahlo. There isn't much one can say in addition when it comes to the life and work of the brilliant Frida Kahlo, but she cannot be absent from the list of most intriguing and influential women artists. In Frida's case, one of the most influential artists in the 20th century painting. Frida Kahlo was born in 1907 in Coyoacán, Mexico, in a family of mixed origin. Her father was of German and Hungarian descent, and her mother had Spanish and Native American ethnicity. Frida had 3 sisters and lived with their family in Coyoacán in a beautiful villa called Casa Azul, or the Blue House. Frida and her father were very close, and we can see many photos he took of her throughout their life. The young Frida had no onset intention of becoming a painter, although she showed talent from an early age and took lessons from and later worked with printmaker Fernando Fernandez. She suffered from polio from early on in her life, and one of her legs didn't fully develop like the other one, and she remained with a limp, which she tried to hide by wearing long skirts her entire life. While in school, she studied literature and art and met Diego Rivera, who was working on a mural project, and she said to a friend she was going to marry him. At the age of 18, Frida was seriously injured when a bus she was riding hit a streetcar and she had a hip and spine fractured, which left her in chronic pain for her entire life. This was a recurrent subject in her paintings, the pain from different events in her life. She was bedridden for a few months in a full-body cast, and she could only move her arms. That is the time she began to paint seriously. Her parents set up an easel and a mirror and provided paints and brushes so she could at least make some self-portraits. She joined the Communist Party in Mexico, and during the events she attended, she met Diego Rivera again and showed him her paintings. He was genuinely impressed and very encouraging. The two of them soon married, with an age difference of 21 years between them. Her mother was a bit horrified also with the physical difference, but her father was comforted by the fact that Rivera had enough money as a renowned artist to take care of Frida's expensive medical needs and many surgeries she would undergo throughout her life. Following her marriage to Rivera, she traveled often throughout the United States, where he had worked. She suffered 2 miscarriages because of her bus accident injuries and was devastated. We can see about this painful time in Kahlo's life in her painting Henry Ford Hospital. The couple's marriage was an unfortunate one, with many affairs on the part of Diego, even with Frida's sister Cristina, which made Frida so very angry. But Frida also had numerous affairs, and one of them, which is kind of unexpected I guess, was with Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, that stayed at Kahlo's and Rivera's home on a few occasions. They had separate homes and working studios, joined together by a bridge, so they each lived their own individual lives. They divorced in 1939, but remarried in 1940, continuing in the same manner with separate lives, numerous affairs. Frida had both men and women lovers, but the men in her life were usually more significant relationships than the women, who were probably more circumstantial and for the experience itself. By this time, Frida had made some of her best work, her iconic self-portraits, Self-Portrait in a Velvet Dress, Frida and Diego Rivera, The Two Fridas, Self-Portrait with the Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird, Memory, The Heart, Whatever the Water Gave Me, to name a few. In 1938, she met French surrealist André Breton, who saw her work and was enormously impressed. He informed her she was a surrealist, which she never fully embraced. She actually never thought much of the surrealists. She even called them stupid. Marcel Duchamp was the only one that really earned her respect. But Duchamp was so much more than just a surrealist. Just like him, Frida looked always in her art to express herself as honestly as she could, as well as the reality around her. Her art had always 2 components: her roots and connection to Mexican culture, spirituality, tradition, whether it be clothing, mysticism, landscape. It was there. The other component was showing her thoughts about what was happening throughout her life to her as an individual in particular, because she was, quote, the subject I know best. Pain, unfortunately, is a ubiquitous component of her work because it joins her throughout her life incessantly. Another thing she did, never change her subject, her vision, her technique, or style to please anyone but herself, because she never looked for fitting in or belonging to any group. She wanted complete freedom. Following her meeting with Breton, she opened her first solo show in New York and encountered resounding success, with some of her works sold and commissions on the way. Her Mexican color ruffled skirts also caused a sensation, as she was quite the exotic presence on the New York scene. What followed was a show in Paris with a few problems, as World War II was looming, but she had the exhibition with the help of Marcel Duchamp that didn't receive the result she encountered in New York. While in Paris, she met fashion designer Elsa Schiaparelli, who designed a dress inspired by Frida, and French Vogue featured an article with photographs of her in its pages. She returned to the US, where she continued to have great success. In 1941, she exhibited at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Boston Institute of Contemporary Art, the Museum of Modern Art, and Peggy Guggenheim's gallery in New York City. The following year, she returned to Mexico and became a founding member of the Seminary of Mexican Culture and teacher at the National Art School La Esmeralda. She continued to exhibit in Mexico and alongside her students, whom she really took care of and promoted. She had spine problems continuously and had unsuccessful surgery. This painful experience can be found in works such as The Wounded Deer, The Broken Column, Without Hope. In the early 1950s, her right leg had to be amputated because of severe gangrene infection. In this period, she was mainly in and out of hospitals and was dependent on painkillers. In the summer of 1954, she had serious pneumonia with high fever, and in one July morning she was found dead in her bed. She was just 47 years old. Many of her notebooks and journals she drew in were filled with sketches of death and angels by this time. There were people around her, like her nurse, that suspected suicide by overdose of painkillers. She tried it before, when she was left without her right leg and Rivera started another affair. She noted, "They amputated my leg. They have given me centuries of torture, and at moments I almost lost my reason. I keep on wanting to kill myself. Diego is what keeps me from it, through my vain idea that he would miss me. But never in my life have I suffered more." After her death, a note written in her diary of sketches and thoughts was found. "I joyfully wait for the exit and hope never to return." Her family home, La Casa Azul, was turned into the Frida Kahlo Museum in 1958, where her ashes are on display in the museum in a pre-Columbian style urn. Leonora Carrington. Leonora Carrington was born in Lancashire, in England in 1917 and grew up to become one of the great surrealist painters that the world is barely just rediscovering nowadays. She came from a privileged background, from a wealthy textile manufacturing family. Her mother was of Irish descent and had a big influence on Leonora's later art, which was mostly inspired by Celtic folklore and mystical spirituality. Her father completely disapproved of her artistic career, but her mother offered support and understanding. She was like all upper-class young girls presented at the court of King George V as a debutante, but found the idea horrid as she didn't want to be married anyway, so she ran off to Paris with Max Ernst instead. She saw a painting of surrealist painter Max Ernst in a gallery in London and was smitten with him before she even met him. This happened a bit later in London. The two of them went to Paris together and Ernst abruptly ended his marriage to be with Carrington, who was 26 years younger. Leonora had studied art formally in England but was attracted to the surrealist movement with which she identified. In France, she began her new life with Max Ernst, living in the south of France and working together, encouraging one another. Their relationship was documented by a few portraits the couple did of one another. But happy days never last for too long. Ernst was imprisoned by the Nazi police in the time that France was under German occupation. They considered his art to be degenerate, and Leonora was taken to Spain by some friends who had her stay at their home in Madrid. She had a nervous breakdown and was committed to a psychiatric institution against her will. There she had shock therapy and was given barbiturates and was even sexually abused. Ernst managed to escape Europe and flee to America with the help of influential art patron Peggy Guggenheim, which he married. Even though their marriage didn't last long, Carrington and Ernst never rekindled their relationship. Leonora escaped Spain and moved to Mexico with the help of Renato Leduc, ambassador of Mexico, which she married just to be able to exit Europe and move to Mexico. They divorced soon after. In the 1940s and 50s, Carrington started working and mingling in Mexico's surrealist circles and began to have her work exhibited. She befriended surrealist painter Remedios Varo and photographer Cathy Horna. Leonora became involved in the women's liberation movement that was happening in Mexico in the early 1970s and even designed a poster for the movement. She tried a second marriage with Enrico Weiss, a photographer and collaborator of the famous Robert Capa, who photographed the Spanish Civil War, among other important events. The marriage resulted in 2 sons, Pablo and Gabriel. Leonora would go on and work and live until the age of 94 in 2011 after complications from pneumonia. Her work is based on harvesting the Celtic stories from her childhood, the power of animals, nature, and their symbols, spiritual practices, and rituals. She drew inspiration from myths and mysticism, and the characters, the creatures in her art are unique, otherworldly beings. In Mexico, she was interested to discover more about Mayan spirituality. She read the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the ancient inhabitants of Mexico before the Spanish conquest, that talks about the creation of the Mayan people. She was interested in alchemy and she made several experiments and alchemical practices in Mexico in her home alongside her friend painter Remedios Varo. She was also a playwright. She wrote things like The Story of the Last Egg in 1970, and later in her life she took up other mediums like sculpture and tapestry. The present time is, unfortunately, the best for Carrington's art as it becomes more and more successful with interest from curators, art historians, and collectors. She could have used that success during her lifetime, especially at the beginning when she painted for herself, never having the intention of showing her art or even thinking someone would want to buy it. Georgia O'Keeffe. Georgia O'Keeffe was born in Wisconsin in 1887 to a family of dairy farmers. She started drawing from an early age and attended Catholic school. Later, after college, she received a teaching position at West Texas State College. In the early 1900s, O'Keeffe was studying at the Art Institute of Chicago, where she was top of her class, even winning a prize for a still life called Dead Rabbit with Copper Pot. This prize sent her to New York, where she visited galleries and ended up at Gallery 291, owned by Alfred Stieglitz, her future husband. She saw there the works of Henri Matisse, Pablo Picasso, Francis Picabia, Marcel Duchamp, Constantin Brancusi, and drawings by sculptor Auguste Rodin, which made a powerful impression on her. She would never forget the gallery and art she found there. She wanted to belong to the same world and not continue with traditional training. After a 4-year break from painting due to illness and taking small jobs for money, she resumed her teaching job in 1911. Around this time, she started to experiment with shape and color and laid the foundation of her later abstract paintings. She continued to teach in various places and complete her own education by taking courses every now and again. She ended up teaching at Columbia College and started her charcoal abstract series, which she sent to Alfred Stieglitz at Gallery 291, who was absolutely thrilled to display them. Next, she started to do the same abstract shapes with watercolor and capture the roughness of the Texan landscape, for which she is best known. O'Keeffe moved to New York to live and work alongside Alfred Stieglitz, whom she will eventually marry. He had many ingenious ideas of promoting Georgia's work, and they were very influential to each other, even though they worked with different mediums. Georgia would often recreate or reinterpret Alfred's photographs in her paintings. In her art, she began to take shapes from nature, especially flowers, and enlarge them or make close-up studies of them until they became an abstract image. Influenced by Purism and Precisionism, two movements that preceded Cubism and grew popular in the United States, O'Keeffe's images of flowers, fruits, landscapes in the Texan desert, or sunsets emerged from a desire to extract the essential from the shape or shapes, to capture a pure image of the subject, not to get it lost in details or make a photographic rendering of it. It could be called a new form of realism, rarefied, refined, and almost symbolic. In addition to flowers and natural landscapes, O'Keeffe made a series of New York skyscrapers that were showed at the Brooklyn Museum in the late 1920s. In 1929, she visited New Mexico for the first time and was enchanted. She felt she belonged there and she would have a lot of inspiration from the desert. It was quiet, pristine, and ready to be discovered. She bought a house there and set up a studio. This is a period of the animal skulls and mountains found in the desert. She spent most of the year alone or with friends in New Mexico to live and paint, and in the winter she would go to New York to exhibit her work. In 1943, she became the first female artist to have a retrospective of her work at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. She and Alfred at this point were living separate lives, each with their own pursuits, but still collaborated in their work. They both had affairs with other people, but when Alfred began to see Dorothy Norman, a beautiful young photographer, she had a nervous breakdown and received treatment in 1938. She never returned to Stieglitz but didn't divorce either. They continued to support each other professionally until his death in 1946. O'Keeffe continued to paint in the New Mexico desert until her eyesight became increasingly impaired. She then started to work with pottery and hired Juan Hamilton, a young artist, to assist her. The two were rumored to have some sort of romantic affair, but nothing was confirmed. Although O'Keeffe left her $65 million estate to Hamilton in her will, much to the revolt of her family members. Hamilton did encourage her to keep painting, even though she only had some peripheral vision left, and introduced her to pottery, which was better suited at that time. She died at 96 years old at Ghost Ranch, her hacienda in New Mexico, where her ashes were scattered. Georgia O'Keeffe was a female artist that had a series of firsts. She received the Freedom Medal of Honor from President Gerald Ford and a National Medal of Arts by Ronald Reagan. She had a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York during her lifetime. In the mid-1940s, she was elected Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She was granted an honorary degree from Harvard University. This is just some of the recognition she got in her lifetime, which was unmatched by all other female painters. She is known as the mother of American modernism. This concludes our visit of great art made by exceptional female artists, and I hope you enjoyed the journey. Do you have a favorite female artist or a favorite work of art by any of them? Write it in the comment section. I would like to know. Thank you for watching, and if you like to continue traveling through art history, I invite you to join me next time as we unravel another layer in art.